The green room at The Tonight Show was unusually crowded that evening, filled with the usual pre-show energy of guests, agents, and production assistants. But in a quiet corner, away from the bustle and conversations, sat an elderly woman completely absorbed in what appeared to be a massive photo album. She wore a faded purple cardigan over a floral dress, and her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun secured with bobby pins that had seen better days. Jimmy Fallon, making his usual pre-show rounds, found himself drawn to her unusual concentration. While everyone else in the room was talking, networking, or checking their phones, this woman was studying each page of her album with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. As Jimmy approached, he could see that the album was enormous, easily 3 inches thick, with pages that had been carefully protected in plastic sleeves. Each page contained not just photographs, but handwritten notes in neat small script that filled every available margin. "Excuse me," Jimmy said gently, not wanting to startle her. "That looks like quite an impressive collection you have there." The woman looked up, and Jimmy was struck by the brightness of her eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably been stylish in the 1980s. She smiled with the warmth of someone who rarely had the opportunity to share her passion with others. "Oh, hello. You're Jimmy Fallon, aren't you? I'm Rose Benedetto. And this," she gestured to the album with obvious pride, "is my life's work." Jimmy sat down in the chair next to her. "Your life's work? What exactly am I looking at?" Rose's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "These are photographs of New York City, but not the New York that tourists see. These are pictures of the New York that's disappearing." She opened the album to a random page and pointed to a photograph of a small corner grocery store with Hebrew lettering in the window. This was Goldstein's Market on the Lower East Side. The family ran it for 63 years. I took this picture the week before they closed because they couldn't afford the rent increase. Jimmy looked more closely at the photograph and the detailed notes Rose had written beside it. "Opened 1961 by Samuel Goldstein, Holocaust survivor," he read aloud. "Known for hand-sliced locks and storing customers' groceries when they couldn't immediately pay. Last day of operation, March 15th, 2023. Replaced by luxury coffee chain." "Every story matters," Rose explained earnestly. "Every business that closes, every building that gets torn down, every family that has to move away because of gentrification. These aren't just statistics. They're the soul of the city being erased." Jimmy turned several pages, finding photographs of old barber shops, family-owned restaurants, small theaters, and neighborhood institutions he recognized, but realized he had never really noticed. Each image was accompanied by Rose's meticulous documentation of the location's history, significance, and ultimate fate. "Rose, this is incredible. How long have you been doing this?" 12 years now," Rose said, adjusting her glasses. "It started when my neighborhood began changing rapidly. I watched places that had been part of my daily life for decades suddenly disappear overnight. I thought someone should document what we're losing." Jimmy was amazed by the scope and detail of Rose's project. "How do you find out all this information about each place?" "I talk to people," Rose said simply. "Store owners, longtime residents, customers who've been going to the same places for decades. Everyone has stories, Mr. Fallon. They're usually eager to share them if someone takes the time to listen." Jimmy looked at a photograph of what appeared to be a small bookstore. "Tell me about this one." Rose's expression grew sad. "That was Chapter and Verse Books in Greenwich Village. It was owned by Maria Santos, who opened it in 1987 when she was fresh out of college. She specialized in poetry and literature by women and minority authors, books you couldn't find anywhere else. Maria knew every customer by name and could recommend the perfect book for anyone who walked through her door. What happened to it? Rent went from $3,200 a month to $12,000 a month when the lease expired. Maria couldn't afford it. She had to close last summer. Rose pointed to her notes. But here's what's beautiful. On her last day, over 200 customers showed up just to say goodbye and thank her for 36 years of service to the community. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, absorbing the profound loss that Rose was documenting. Rose, what do you do with all this information? Where do you share these stories? Rose's expression grew slightly embarrassed. Well, I don't really share them anywhere. I've tried sending some of the stories to newspapers and local websites, but most of them say they're too local interest or not newsworthy enough. I have a small blog that maybe 20 people read, including my nephew in Jersey. But you keep documenting anyway? Of course, Rose said with quiet determination. Someone has to bear witness. Someone has to remember. These places and people shaped our city for generations. If we don't record their stories, it's like they never existed. Jimmy was struck by the profound loneliness of Rose's mission, spending years carefully documenting the disappearing soul of her city, with almost no one paying attention to her work. Rose, can I ask why you're here tonight? Are you part of our audience? Oh, yes, Rose said brightly. My nephew Tony got me tickets for my birthday. He thought it would cheer me up because I've been a bit melancholy lately about how much of the city I've lost. Lost? Well, in the past 6 months, I've had to photograph 15 final closings, 15 places that had been part of New York's fabric for decades, just gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm just documenting death, you know? Jimmy felt something shift in his chest. Here was a woman who had dedicated 12 years of her life to preserving the memory of her changing city, working entirely alone, with almost no recognition or support. Rose, would you mind showing me a few more of your favorites? The places that meant the most to you personally? Rose's eyes lit up again. She turned to a section near the beginning of the album. This was Carmine's shoe repair on Bleecker Street. Carmine Rossi learned cobbling from his father in Italy and opened this shop in 1959. He could fix any shoe, any boot, any leather item. People would bring him things their grandparents had owned, and he'd make them like new. The photograph showed an elderly man with kind eyes standing behind a counter covered in shoes and leather tools. Rose's notes detailed Carmine's immigration story, his family's history, and the decades of loyal customers who had kept their shoes rather than throwing them away because Carmine could always save them. Carmine worked until he was 87 years old, Rose continued. When he finally retired, no one wanted to take over the business. The landlord converted the space into a boutique that sells $60 candles. Jimmy looked at another page, showing a small diner with red vinyl booths and a hand-painted sign. And this? Mickey's All-Night Diner. It was open 24 hours a day for 43 years. Mickey Kowalski served coffee and eggs to taxi drivers, hospital workers, insomniacs, and anyone else who needed a warm meal at 3 a.m. He knew everyone's order by heart. Rose's voice grew softer. Mickey said his diner was like a lighthouse, always open, always welcoming, a safe harbor for people who were lost or working through the night. When he couldn't afford the property taxes anymore, the city lost more than just a restaurant. It lost a gathering place, a community anchor. Jimmy was becoming increasingly moved by the depth of Rose's work and the stories she was preserving. Rose, these aren't just photographs. This is oral history. This is anthropology. This is incredibly important documentation. Rose looked surprised. You really think so? Most people just see them as old buildings and failed businesses? No, Rose. What you're documenting is how cities actually work. Not the glossy, tourist-friendly version, but the real ecosystem of neighborhood relationships and community institutions that make a place feel like home. Jimmy made a decision that would surprise both of them. Rose, would you be willing to share some of these stories on the show tonight? I think our audience would be fascinated to see New York through your eyes. Rose stared at Jimmy in disbelief. On television? Mr. Fallon, I'm just an old lady with a photo album. Rose, you're a historian, an archivist, and a storyteller. You're preserving the soul of New York City. That's not just anything. 30 minutes later, Jimmy was introducing Rose to his studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet someone very special. Rose Benedetto has spent the past 12 years photographing and documenting the parts of New York City that are disappearing. She's created an incredible archive of the small businesses, family-owned shops, and community gathering places that make our city unique. Rose walked onto the Tonight Show stage carrying her massive photo album, looking nervous but determined. The studio audience applauded warmly, though Jimmy could tell they weren't sure what to expect. Rose, Jimmy said once they were seated at his desk, tell our audience what inspired you to start this project. Well, Jimmy, I watched my neighborhood change so rapidly that I felt like I was losing pieces of my own life story. The bakery where I bought bread for 30 years, the hardware store where the owner knew exactly which screw I needed just by looking at what I brought in, the little theater where I saw my first off-Broadway play. All of these places were disappearing, and it was as if they had never mattered. Jimmy could see the audience becoming more engaged as Rose spoke with genuine passion about her work. So, you decided to document them? Someone had to, Rose said simply. I realized that when these places close, we don't just lose businesses. We lose stories, relationships, community history. We lose the things that make a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood instead of just a collection of buildings. Jimmy asked Rose to share some of her favorite photographs and stories. As she opened her album on his desk and began telling the story of Goldstein's Market, then Mickey's All-Night Diner, then Carmine's Shoe Repair, something remarkable happened in the studio. The audience became completely silent, absorbed in Rose's stories. These weren't just tales of businesses closing. They were stories about immigration, family legacy, community support, and the human connections that make cities livable. When Rose told the story of chapter and verse books and the 200 customers who came to say goodbye on the last day, several audience members were visibly moved. Rose, Jimmy said, what happens to all these stories? Where do they go when you've documented them? Well, that's the problem, Rose admitted. I have 12 years of stories, but they mostly just sit in my apartment. I've written to historical societies and city agencies, but everyone says they don't have resources for this kind of local documentation. Jimmy looked at Rose, then at his audience, then back at Rose. What if we change that? What if we found a way to make sure your work gets the recognition and preservation it deserves? Rose looked confused. What do you mean? Jimmy turned to address the audience and cameras. Folks, what Rose is doing is invaluable. She's creating a record of how New York City has changed over the past 12 years, not from the perspective of politicians or developers, but from the perspective of the communities and small businesses that actually make up the fabric of the city. He looked back at Rose. Rose, what would you say if I told you we wanted to help you digitize and share these stories? What if we created a website where people could explore your archive and add their own stories about disappearing places in their neighborhoods? Rose's eyes filled with tears. You would do that? You would help me preserve these stories? Not just preserve them, Rose. Share them. Because I think there are people all over the country who are watching their own communities change and feeling the same sense of loss you felt. Your work could inspire others to document their own local history. After the show, Jimmy's production team worked with Rose to plan what became the Memory Project, a digital archive that would house Rose's photographs and stories, along with submissions from people across the country documenting the disappearing pieces of their own communities. But the most immediate impact was on Rose herself. Within hours of the show airing, Rose's small blog crashed from the traffic of people wanting to read her stories. She received hundreds of emails from viewers sharing their own memories of places like the ones she had documented. "I had no idea so many people felt the same way I do," Rose told Jimmy when she returned to the show 3 months later to discuss the project's success. "People are sending me stories about their own neighborhoods, their own lost gathering places. We're creating a collective memory of American community life." The Memory Project had grown to include submissions from over 30 states with people documenting everything, from small-town diners to urban barbershops to rural general stores. Rose had become the coordinator of a nationwide effort to preserve local history before it disappeared forever. "What I've learned," Rose said during her return visit, "is that every community has someone like me, someone who notices what's disappearing and feels sad about the loss but doesn't know what to do about it. The Memory Project gives those people a way to take action." Jimmy was amazed by how Rose's simple documentation project had inspired a movement. "Rose, you've become the keeper of American community memory." "We all have," Rose corrected. "Everyone who contributes a story, everyone who reads and shares these histories, everyone who realizes that the places we gather and do business matter to who we are as communities. We're all memory keepers now." The massive photo album that Rose had brought to the show that first night was eventually donated to the New York Historical Society, but not before being completely digitized for the Memory Project. Rose continued her documentation work, but now she wasn't working alone. She had teams of volunteer photographers and story collectors in dozens of cities. "I used to think I was just taking pictures of buildings," Rose reflected during a later interview. "But what I was really doing was taking pictures of relationships, the relationship between business owners and customers, between neighbors and gathering places, between past and present." Rose's work inspired city planners and community organizations to think differently about development and preservation. Several cities created community memory programs that required developers to document the history and community significance of properties before making changes. But perhaps the most important outcome was more personal. Rose, who had spent 12 years working in isolation, documenting loss with little recognition, had become part of a national community of people committed to preserving local history and community memory. "I thought I was trying to save the past," Rose told Jimmy during one of her regular check-ins on the show. "But what I was really doing was saving the future, because if we don't remember what we've lost, we can't rebuild it. And if we don't know our own community stories, we can't pass them on to the next generation." The notebook that Rose had carried for 12 years, filled with addresses of closed businesses and notes about community history, had become the foundation for a new understanding of how communities preserve their identity in times of rapid change. Jimmy kept one of Rose's original photographs in his office, a picture of a small corner grocery store that had closed the day before Rose photographed it. In her notes beside the image, Rose had written, "Every ending is also a beginning, if someone cares enough to remember the story." The Memory Project continued to grow, but its success was measured not just in the number of stories collected, but in the number of communities that had begun to see themselves as worth documenting, worth remembering, worth preserving. Rose had shown people that their local stories mattered, that their community institutions had value, and that the work of bearing witness to change was itself a form of love. It wasn't just late-night television. It was a reminder that memory is not just about the past, but about how we choose to honor what has shaped us, and how we decide what stories are worth saving for the people who come after us.